Let's start with something uncomfortable because this episode isn't about comfort, it's about truth. Stress does not appear, stress does not happen to you. Stress is not something the world does to you. Stress is generated, and it's generated inside your own mind. That alone is enough to make some people turn this episode off immediately because it removes the one thing they've been taught to cling to their entire lives. The idea that stress is something external, something imposed, or something unavoidable. But if you stay with me and you really hear what I'm saying, you'll realize this is actually one of the most empowering things you could ever learn. Because if stress is generated internally, then it can be eliminated internally. And that brings us to the real subject of this episode: eliminating stress by controlling your mind, not managing it, not coping with it, not soothing it, controlling it. Now, let me be very clear right from the start. Controlling your mind is a skill. And like any real skill, flying an airplane, riding a motorcycle, mastering martial arts, it requires willingness, discipline, repetition, and personal responsibility. There's no shortcut, there is no pill, and there is no guru who will do it for you. And that's exactly why most people never learn how. They've been trained and conditioned to believe that stress is normal. They've been trained and conditioned to believe anxiety is unavoidable. They've been trained to believe their thoughts are automatic and uncontrollable. But years ago, I knew someone who was constantly stressed at work. Every day felt like a pressure. Every conversation felt loaded. Every email felt like a threat. According to him, the stress was caused by his boss, the deadlines, the workload, the environment, the company culture. You name it, he had an excuse for it. But when you actually listen to what was happening in his head, something different was going on inside. Before his boss even said a word, his mind already started narrating. What if I mess this up? What if I get blamed? What if I look incompetent? What if this leads to something worse? None of that was happening in reality. It was happening entirely in his own imagination. And yet, he responded as if there was real danger staring him in the face. His heart rate went up, his shoulders tightened without him noticing it. His breathing became shallow, and irritation started building up. Nothing had actually happened. But his subconscious didn't know that because it can't tell the difference. What he was experiencing in that moment was stress being manufactured in real time, entirely from his own thoughts alone. This is where most people get confused. They assume stress comes from events, from what's happening around them, but it doesn't. Stress comes from the interpretation of events. More specifically, stress comes from thoughts, the imagination. And thoughts are things you can learn to observe, interpret, redirect, and eventually command. But schools don't teach that. Just imagine how better society would be if this was taught to kids in school. How to control their emotions by controlling their thoughts, by taking responsibility for the stories they run through their heads. Instead, we're raised in systems that actually benefit from untrained minds. Governments benefit from anxious populations. Media benefits from fear based attention. Advertisers benefit from insecurity. Institutions benefit from obedience. And yes, fear is used to cause people to be obedient. For example, religions, when used or misused, benefit from guilt, judgment, and fear of divine retribution. Let's not dance around that. Any system that teaches you to distrust your own inner authority while outsourcing it to an external source becomes a factory for stress producing thought patterns. That doesn't mean that spirituality or religion is the enemy. It means conditioning without self mastery is dangerous. And here's what many people don't like to hear. Once you become aware of this, responsibility shifts to you. You don't get to say, well, society made me like this, society made me stressed out, and stop there. No. Awareness is the line. Once you become aware, you become responsible. On one side of the awareness line, conditioning explains behavior. But on the other side, responsibility begins, personal responsibility. That is the warrior threshold. A warrior does not deny that manipulation exists. It does. A warrior simply refuses to be ruled by it and takes responsibility for directing his own mind so that his mind is not directed by someone else. Now, this is where we need to talk about something most people misunderstand completely: worry. Most people don't realize that worry is another form of imagination. They think worry is being responsible, they think it's being cautious, they think it's planning ahead. But if you slow it down and really look at it, worry is nothing more than imagination pointed in the wrong direction. When you worry, nothing is happening in the present moment. There is no immediate danger. There is no crisis unfolding right in front of you. What you're doing instead is mentally projecting yourself into a negative future that does not exist, and then emotionally reacting to that image, to that imagined future, as if it were real. That's imagination used in the wrong way. Picture someone lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling. The house is quiet, the day is over, nothing's happening, and yet their mind is busy running scenarios. What if I lose my job? What if something happens to my family? What if I can't pay my bills next month? What if I make the wrong decision? But none of those things are happening right now. And the subconscious doesn't know that. It cannot tell the difference between what is real and what is imagined. So the heart starts racing, the stomach tightens, the muscles tense, sleep becomes restless. That is stress generated entirely by worry. And worry feels convincing because it uses the same inner machinery that creativity uses, the same mental screen, the same emotional feedback loop. The only difference is what direction it's pointing in, positive or negative. When imagination is pointed towards worst case futures, we call it worry. When imagination is pointed towards desired outcomes, we call it vision or visualization. It's the same tool, just used differently. And once you see that clearly, worry loses its authority over you. Now, let me give you another example, one that's painfully real. I once worked with someone who had a very particular habit, and I recognized it for exactly what it was right away. Every Friday afternoon. And it was always on a Friday afternoon, just before everyone was about to sign off for the weekend. He would suddenly call a meeting, and during the meeting, he would casually point out something he didn't like. Not in an explosive way, not angrily, just enough to plant a thought, a negative thought. He might say something like, "Oh, that's not good," or "That could be a problem," or "Yeah, that's not great." And then, almost as an afterthought, he'd smile and add, "But don't worry about it. We'll deal with it on Monday. Have a nice weekend." If you've ever been on the receiving end of something like that, you might not have consciously recognized it for what it was, not in the moment. And that's completely normal. Most people simply aren't used to or have not been taught how to observe their mental reactions in real time. The real impact isn't the criticism itself, it shows up later when the conversation is over. You've left the room and your mind starts imagining worst case scenarios. An untrained mind takes those small comments and turns them into something bigger. It spends the entire weekend replaying it, expanding it, and filling in the gaps, giving meaning to something that had no meaning to begin with. What did he really mean? How serious is this? Is this going to turn into something bigger? Is my job at risk? What if Monday goes badly? And just like that, a perfectly good weekend is gone. Not because anything actually happened, but because the mind kept imagining the worst. That's not stress coming from outside of you. That is stress being generated internally, moment by moment, through the imagination. Now, here's the important part of this story. By that time in my life, I had already been training my mind for a long time. So when that familiar spiral tried to start, that mental spiral, when that thought tried to take root, I saw it immediately for what it was. I didn't argue with it. I didn't try to reason with it. I didn't follow it down the rabbit hole. Instead, I made a very simple and very deliberate decision. I told myself, I told my mind clearly and firmly, I intend to enjoy every minute of my weekend. And that was it. There was no debate, no justification to my mind, and no analysis, no overthinking. I didn't ask my mind for permission. I didn't negotiate with it. I stated my intention and then I lived it. And my mind followed. Why? Because I have a mind. My mind does not have me. Please think about that. That isn't magic. It isn't luck. And it isn't pretending that nothing happened. It's training. That's what happens when you stop being dragged by your thoughts and start directing them. Most people never do this because they're waiting for confidence to show up before they take action. They would tell themselves something like, once I feel confident, then I'll do it. But that's not how it actually works. Confidence doesn't come first, action does. Confidence is what shows up after you've taken action again and again and again, not before it. I've seen this played out over and over again in real life. People terrified to ride motorcycles, people afraid to speak up in meetings, people completely paralyzed by fear of failure. And every one of them tells the same story. I can't do it because I don't have confidence. But that logic is backwards. You don't act because you're confident. You become confident because you act. The same principle applies to mental control. You don't wait until your mind is calm before you start training it. You train it precisely because it's not calm. And yes, at first, that process will feel uncomfortable. Your mind will resist. It will try to pull you back into old habits. It will try to drag you back into familiar stress loops because that's what it's been conditioned to do. That's called your comfort zone. That resistance isn't failure, it's a normal reaction of an untrained mind. But normal does not equal acceptable. Please think about that. An untrained horse doesn't suddenly become obedient because you asked it nicely or hope for the best. It responds to consistent direction over time. And that is exactly what the mind requires as well. This is where people like to pretend they're powerless. They shrug and say, but thoughts just happen. Yes, they do. So does gravity. That doesn't mean you jump off a building without learning how to work with it. Automatic thoughts are the result of conditioning. Directed thoughts are the result of training. And training, by definition, requires repetition. That's why martial artists drill endlessly. That's why musicians practice scales day after day. That's why fighter pilots train constantly. Not because danger is always present, but because when danger is present, there's no time to figure things out. You need to get to the point where you are acting on muscle memory and not having to think about what you need to do next. That's why training is so important. And it is equally applied to mind mastery as it is to any other mental skill. And in fact, if you think about a fighter pilot, a fighter pilot constantly practicing his art is training his mind. Isn't that obvious? And in the same way, you can train yourself to master and eliminate stress. The point is that stress works in the same way. By the time you feel stress in your body or in your mind, the thought that generated it has already occurred. So the goal isn't to stop thoughts from ever arising. The real goal is to shorten the time between the thought and your conscious command over it. In other words, shorten the time between the thought and your awareness of that thought. Then you can act immediately. At first, stress might last minutes. With practice, it drops to seconds. And eventually, it doesn't arise at all because the mind learns who is in control. And this is the part that no one who sells stress management really wants you to understand. Managed stress still exists. Eliminated stress does not. If people were taught how to eliminate stress at the source, an entire industry would disappear overnight. But if stress is only managed, especially through long term prescriptions and ongoing interventions, it becomes a very profitable industry, the stress industry. Think about that. Often at the expense of the person who is suffering. Stress is not a permanent fixture in life, it's a byproduct of mental mismanagement. In other words, the wrong use of the imagination. When you learn to interrupt, redirect, and deliberately replace thought patterns, stress has nowhere to take hold. You stop rehearsing imagined disasters. You stop narrating worst case scenarios. You stop feeding emotional reactions with unexamined beliefs. You become selective about what you allow to live in your mind. And that selectivity is freedom. Now let's bring this full circle. Yes, there are systems that attempt to program fear. Yes, there are people who intentionally plant doubt. Yes, there are institutions that profit from stress. But once you understand that mechanism, they lose control and leverage over you completely. You stop reacting automatically. You stop being predictable to them. You stop being manipulated. And that is why this work matters. Not because it makes you feel better for a moment, but because it restores your sovereignty, your mental and emotional sovereignty. Your mind becomes a tool instead of a battlefield. And when that happens, stress doesn't need to be managed. It disappears because it was never real to begin with. It was your imagination. Perhaps it was triggered by someone else, a puppet master, or someone gaslighting you, or whatever. But the bottom line is they triggered your imagination. And that is what generated the stress. And imagination, when trained, becomes your greatest asset, not your enemy. That's what this episode is about. And that's why learning to control your mind is not optional if you want a life of actual improvement, a life that actually improves. If you want the extended version where we go deeper into advanced mental training, deliberate intention, disciplined imagination, and warrior level responsibility, that's available on Patreon. And if you want the full system, the actual instructions for the machinery between your ears, that's why I wrote the Human User Manual. Because stress doesn't need to be managed, it needs to be eliminated. And it can be when you learn to take control of your mind.